Professor Kass writes in the book, he says, I have come to regard myself as an integral participant of the book on page 11. And I just want to begin by saying, I love that approach because as I read the book, I feel as if Professor Cass takes us on a journey. There's moments when he's imagining, what's going on with these midwives or what's Pharaoh thinking here in a manner that really resonates with some of the traditions that permeate the African American Protestant tradition. He feels in many ways like a black preacher on First Sunday, just reflecting with us on what might be happening or not happening in the story that's not dogmatic, but just fuels the imagination and our ability to place ourselves in the story and see this not just as a scholarly text to engage, but as a story that is relevant to our lives. Professor Cass has done a great service to students of the Book of Exodus in founding God's nation. He observes accurately, in my opinion, that Exodus carries its persuasive power in itself. Access to the truths it might contain does not require prior faith, prior traditional or religious commitments, reliance on outside authorities. Certainly, this observation has proven true among African Americans. I wrote several years ago, Black solidarity with Exodus is something of an enigma, especially considering the ways that scripture was used during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries to justify chattel slavery. However, since slavery, African Americans have drawn on the narrative's discursive power to articulate identity, create community, and reject tyranny against the backdrop of the nation's vicious legacy of white supremacy. Tonight, I hope to engage Professor Cass's reading of Exodus from the standpoint of what has been called the Black prophetic tradition. I should note that I really value, and he mentioned this in his opening comments, Cass's wisdom seeking approach to Exodus. I love the ways in which he tries to understand the text from the perspective of those who lived its events. Rhetorically, this approach invites readers to recognize the points of intersection between the world of Exodus and contemporary society. One of the central themes that surfaces in this approach is that of peoplehood and nation building. Professor Cass is intimately interested in the ways in which the Egyptian bondage served as a catalyst for nation building and peoplehood. I found his discussion of Israel's response to the genocidal efforts of Pharaoh to be especially relevant as I thought about the African American tradition. Concerning Pharaoh, Professor Cass writes, it was only his efforts to limit the Israelites' fertility that put them on the path to becoming a people in a more than biological sense. And I hope you all hear what Professor Cass is saying right there. As soon as I engaged that quote, my mind immediately went to the work of James Baldwin in his book, The Devil Finds Work, where he writes, the wretched of the earth do not decide to become extinct. They resolve, on the contrary, to multiply. Life is their only weapon against life. Life is all they have. Within the various forms of oppression that Israel faced in Egypt, Professor Cass sees a catalyst to collective identity. African slaves discovered this same catalyst. Scholars often make the mistake of treating African slaves as a united whole. The problem with this approach is that this approach fails to recognize the deep divisions that often characterize those who were kidnapped across the Atlantic. Slaves were by no means a united whole when they arrived to the so called New World. In fact, they held different tribal affiliations, they spoke different languages, and oftentimes were at odds with one another. And these differences, these different subject positions, we might argue, were often utilized by masters to keep the slaves at odds with one another. The masters did everything they could to keep the slaves separate. However, in the Exodus, slaves located an identity that transcended the divisions that were used to keep them apart. It constituted them as a collective whole. You see, America in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries imagines itself to be a contemporary promised land, and its inhabitants to be a contemporary Israel. America, for the slaves, though, it was not a promised land, it was Egypt. America uses this promised land motif to justify a whole host of imperial practices, including chattel slavery, genocidal aggressions against Native American brothers and sisters, the oppression of Chinese farm workers later on in the 19th century. But what the slaves do is they draw on the Exodus as an inventional source, Cicero might say, to reimagine the US. I think Eddie Glaude of Princeton University is correct when he points out that the Exodus provided a sense of peoplehood that emerged through a hermeneutic of biblical typology. That is, the slaves become New Israel in American Egypt, looking for divine deliverance from oppression. In a society that defines them as subhuman, the slaves drew on the Exodus to recover a sense of humanity. As the church historian Albert Rabbitoe argues, by appropriating the story of Exodus as their own story, Black Christians articulated their own sense of peoplehood. Exodus symbolized their common history and common destiny. I want to make sure you all hear that last phrase. Exodus symbolized their common history and common destiny. If you've read Dr. Kass's new book, you'll notice that in the epilogue, he argues one general point that emerges simply from the three-pillared structure of Israel's founding. Can a people endure and flourish if it lacks a shared national story, accepted law and morals, and an aspiration to something higher than its own comfort and safety? Can a devotion to technological progress, economic prosperity, and private pursuits of happiness sustain us when our story is contested, our morals weakened, and our national dedication abandoned? He proceeds to say, express his doubts for this possibility. And so when we understand the African American tradition or traditional African American readings of the Exodus, understand this narrative provided the discursive resources for a nation within a nation to emerge. Second, Kass not only reads the Exodus as something that serves as a catalyst for nation building or peoplehood, but he reads the Exodus as self-revelation of the divine. From God's revelation to Moses to his powerful deliverance of Israel from Egyptian bondage, the reader gains a clearer perspective of divine priorities and divine nature. One of the fundamental questions that occupied the minds of slaveholders in the US is how do you keep a people oppressed within the institution of slavery? During the 18th century, Protestant slaveholding populations often invoked Pauline epistles to justify and defend chattel slavery in theological terms. One of the central questions that illuminated religious life on this side of the pond during the 18th century concerned what do we do with slaves who convert to Christianity? To this, we look to our friends across the pond in the in the UK. And in 1740, Thomas Seeker, then Bishop of Oxford, later Archbishop of Canterbury, writes to American Protestants. He says, as human authority hath granted them none of Scripture, far from making any alteration in civil rights, expressly directs that every man abide in the condition wherein he is called. You see the Pauline appeals there? With great indifference of mind concerning outward circumstances. And the only rule it prescribes for servants of the same religion with their masters is not to despise them because they are brethren, but to do them service. It's important to hear what's happening here because I would suggest that many religious contexts have not recovered from this move in the 300 years since it was written. What's happening here is Seeker is separating secular realities from eternal realities. He's separating the sacred from the temporal. And he's saying, it's okay if you're a slave, you shouldn't fight it at all. He's saying the Bible has nothing to say to it. But what's happening here is the slaveholding population is attempting to provide the divine endorsement for the institution of slavery. But the slaves and later generations of African Americans draw on the Exodus to articulate a counter theology to the hegemonic articulations of Judeo Christian doctrine. Or, as Cornel West might say, they draw on the Exodus to practice prophetic Christianity as a response to Constantinian Christianity that dominated the American landscape. As Martin Luther King Jr. said right after he returns from Ghana following its liberation from British colonialism, he says, "There is something in the Exodus story of every people struggling for freedom. It is the first story of man's explicit quest for freedom, and it demonstrates the stages that seem to inevitably follow the quest for freedom." Kass locates similar potential in the Exodus. He writes, "The last promise, full of liberation and redemption, accompanied by retribution, the great judgments, is altogether new. God reveals that he is an emancipator, a deliverer, and a judge who will redeem his people from burdensome servitude and punish their oppressors." So, what's happening here is Cass is locating, and this is consistent with what we see in the African American readings of the Exodus. He's locating a counter theology to a theology that justifies empire in very problematic ways, that oppresses others. He's saying, no, no, no. The Exodus is saying, no, God is a liberator. And that was a revolutionary approach for African Americans who are hearing that you are destined to slavery for the rest of your lives. What Cass is highlighting here is that theology teaches, I mean, that Exodus teaches a theology of liberation. There's a reason why slave masters did not want Exodus preached to their slaves. And there's another reason why the first Negro spiritual ever produced in the US is what? Go Down Moses. It's because that's what the slaves see as instrumental in their liberation. It provided them with an alternative theology to the one that imprisoned them. The third thing that I want to mention ever so briefly, because my timer's telling me I'm gonna run out of time, and my mama told me do what you're told and sit down, and I plan to follow that advice today. Um, I love Cass's emphasis on communal sin and collective guilt, because I think, particularly in a US context, it's our failure to appreciate communal sin and collective guilt that has doomed us, or has rendered us unable to talk about the persistence of racism and racial injustice in our midst. One of the problems that we have so much here is that we don't have a language to talk about racial injustice as it occurs in systemic ways. And so, what Cass does by drawing attention to collective guilt and communal sin is he provides us with a typology, with a language by which we can talk about racism and the persistence of white supremacist logics in our midst in a way that allows us to engage them and navigate them. The question, and I'm rushing to my conclusion here, the question that I'm left with, having read this wonderful book, is concerns the limits of the Exodus for groups, for marginal groups like African Americans who adopt it as a framework for contemporary life. So we understand from the Exodus that it provides collective identity, that it can even offer emancipatory theology. But what are the limits of the Exodus? Cass hints at this question in the epilogue, where he writes, "Politically, we 21st century Americans still have much to learn from the Exodus, precisely because we are not theocrats, but loyal, yet worries members of the modern liberal democracy. History shows us that inflammatory mixtures of religion and politics can have deadly consequences, from the Crusades, the Inquisition, the 30 Years' Wars, to today's Islamist jihad against the infidels." So there's a hint there that, like, there can be limits to how we can use this. There's some discursive barriers, and so even as I read that, one of the thoughts that came to mind was Langston Hughes' poem "Promised Land." Langston Hughes writes, "The promised land is always just ahead. You will not reach it ere you're dead, but your children's children by their children will be led to a spot from which the land still lies the head, still lies ahead. And so the question that I'm left with is, yes, I think the Exodus holds significant wisdom for us in our moment. But what are the limits of this wisdom and our ability to apply it to our contemporary reality? Thank you all so much for the opportunity to be with you today.